It's not what you think. Just let me explain.
Mary's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Message after message lit up the screen as her trembling hands struggled to hold it steady. Tears streamed down her face, blurring the words that were destroying her world one text at a time. How could you do this to Dad? We saw everything. Don't contact us again. Her sons. Her boys. The two people she loved most in this world, and they were cutting her out of their lives. My sons thought they caught me cheating on their father. They didn't know the truth. And by the time they found out, it was already too late. But to understand how everything fell apart so completely, we need to go back. Back to that morning when Mary's world was still intact, even if it was held together by the thinnest of threads. It was a Tuesday morning in suburban Connecticut, and Mary Henderson was doing what she did every Tuesday morning. She was preparing lunch in her modest two-story home, the same home where she'd raised her family, the same home where her husband Vincent had taken his last breath 2 years earlier. At 52 years old, Mary wore her grief like a second skin. Her warm brown hair, now streaked with silver she hadn't bothered to color, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She was wearing Vincent's old cardigan, the navy blue one that still smelled faintly of his cologne if she pressed it close enough to her face. She did that more often than she'd ever admit to anyone. The house was quiet that morning. Too quiet. It had been too quiet for 2 years now. As Mary moved through the kitchen, slicing vegetables for a salad she probably wouldn't eat, her eyes drifted to the photos on the mantel. There he was. Vincent. Her Vincent. Frozen in time at 50 years old, his arm around her shoulders, that crooked smile she'd fallen in love with 30 years ago lighting up his face. The cancer had taken him slowly, painfully, but these photos showed him as he'd been before the diagnosis. Strong. Vibrant. Alive. Next to that photo were her sons. Garrett, 28 now, with his father's dark eyes and serious expression. And Elliot, 25, who'd inherited Vincent's sense of humor and easy laugh. Her boys. Her reasons for getting out of bed every morning even when the grief threatened to pull her under. The doorbell rang, jolting Mary from her thoughts. She glanced at the clock. 11:30. Right on time. She opened the door to find Dominic Keller standing on her porch. Late 40s, wearing a crisp charcoal suit that spoke of professional success, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive. His expression was kind but serious, the look of a man who dealt with difficult situations for a living. Mary's hands were shaking as she welcomed him inside. This meeting had been weeks in the making, and now that it was finally happening, she wasn't sure she was ready. She led him through the familiar hallways of her home, past the photos of happier times, into the living room where sunlight streamed through the windows Vincent had insisted on enlarging when they'd renovated 15 years ago. They sat together on the couch, closer than strangers would normally sit, but Mary needed to see the documents clearly, and Dominic understood. He'd been patient with her through this entire process. More patient than she probably deserved given how many times she'd cancelled previous appointments. Dominic spread papers across the coffee table. Legal documents with dense paragraphs and official seals. Mary's eyes scanned the words, but they might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the sense they made through her anxiety. That's when Dominic did something simple, something kind. He placed his hand over hers, steady and reassuring as fresh tears began to stream down Mary's face. She wiped at them with her free hand, embarrassed by her emotion but unable to stop it. She was so focused on the papers in front of her, so lost in the wave of grief and confusion washing over her, that she didn't hear the car pulling into her driveway. She didn't see her son Garrett climbing out, using the key she'd given him for emergencies to let himself in through the side door. Garrett had decided to surprise his mother with a visit. He'd been busy with work lately, caught up in a major marketing campaign that had consumed his last 3 weeks. He felt guilty about not checking in on her more often, and today he'd decided to make up for it. Maybe take her to lunch. Make sure she was eating properly. Make sure she was okay. He stepped into the hallway, his mouth already opening to call out a greeting when he froze. Through the gap in the doorway he could see into the living room. His mother was sitting on the couch with a man he'd never seen before. A well-dressed stranger who was sitting far too close to her. The man's hand was covering hers, an intimate gesture that made Garrett's stomach turn. His mother was crying, wiping away tears as this stranger leaned in close, speaking to her in low tones Garrett couldn't quite make out. The scene before him didn't make sense. And then all at once it made terrible, horrible sense. Garrett's face went through a series of rapid transformations. Shock first, his eyes widening as his brain tried to process what he was seeing. Then confusion because this couldn't be what it looked like. His mother wouldn't do this. Not to Dad. Not after everything. But the confusion quickly crystallized into something else entirely. Betrayal. Sharp and piercing, stabbing through his chest like a physical wound. And on its heels came anger, hot and overwhelming, flooding through his veins like poison. His mother was holding hands with another man. She was crying with another man. She was having some kind of intimate moment with another man in the house where his father had died, while wearing his father's cardigan. Garrett's hand moved almost automatically, pulling his phone from his pocket. He angled it through the doorway gap, making sure to capture both figures on the couch, their joined hands, the intimate proximity, his mother's tears. The camera shutter clicked silently in digital mode. Evidence. Proof of what he'd seen. He backed away slowly, carefully, his heart hammering so hard he was sure they'd hear it. But they were too engrossed in their moment, in their papers, in whatever was happening between them to notice him. Garrett made it back to the side door, back to his car, moving on autopilot while his mind screamed. Once inside his vehicle, parked in his mother's driveway, Garrett's hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold his phone. The photo stared back at him from the screen, undeniable evidence of what felt like the ultimate betrayal. He pulled up his brother's contact. Elliot needed to know. Elliot deserved to know what their mother was doing behind their backs. His thumbs flew across the keyboard as rage and hurt poured out of him in a text message. Mom has been lying to us. He attached the photo and hit send before he could second-guess himself. The response came within seconds. His phone was ringing, Elliot's name flashing across the screen. Garrett answered, and before he could even speak, Elliot's voice came through, tight with tension. What the hell is this? Who is that guy? I don't know, Garrett's voice cracked, and he hated himself for it. I came to surprise Mom with lunch and I found them together. He was holding her hand, Elliot. They were sitting there like they were a couple or something. There was silence on the other end, and Garrett could picture his younger brother processing this information, going through the same emotional journey he'd just experienced. When Elliot spoke again, his voice was different. Harder. How long do you think this has been going on? I don't know. But she's wearing Dad's cardigan while she's with him. Can you believe that? Dad's cardigan. Another beat of silence, and then Elliot said exactly what Garrett was thinking. Dad hasn't even been gone 3 years. 3 years and she's already moved on? Like he meant nothing. I know, Garrett said, his grip tightening on the steering wheel with his free hand. I can't believe this. I can't believe she'd do this. What are we going to do? Elliot asked, and Garrett could hear the pain beneath his brother's anger. I don't know, Garrett admitted. But I can't look at her right now. I can't pretend I didn't see this. Me neither, Elliot agreed. She's been calling us her rock since Dad died, leaning on us, and all this time she's been what, dating? Moving on while we're still grieving him. The conversation continued, the two brothers feeding each other's anger and hurt, building a wall of betrayal between themselves and their mother brick by painful brick. They talked about how devoted their father had been, how he'd fought the cancer for her sake, holding on longer than the doctors thought possible because he couldn't bear to leave her. They talked about the funeral, how broken she'd seemed, how they'd believed her grief was as deep as their own. Had it all been an act? By the time they hung up, both brothers had made a decision. They needed space. They needed time to process this. They couldn't talk to their mother right now, not when they were this angry, not when the betrayal felt this fresh and raw. They agreed to cut contact. At least temporarily. At least until they figured out what to say to a woman who'd apparently decided their father's memory wasn't worth honoring. Garrett started his car and pulled out of the driveway, leaving his mother inside with her secret companion, completely unaware that her world was about to implode. Inside the house, Mary was finally getting control of her emotions. She took the tissue Dominic offered her and dabbed at her eyes, trying to pull herself together. They still had so much to discuss, so many decisions to make. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter, silent for now. But that silence wouldn't last long. Within the hour, Mary's phone would start buzzing. Text messages from both her sons, each one more painful than the last. Messages filled with accusations and hurt, with betrayal and anger. Messages that would make her world crumble around her as she realized what her boys thought they'd seen. She would try to call Garrett first. The call would go straight to a decline screen. She'd try Elliot next. Voicemail. She'd text them both, her fingers flying across the keyboard in desperation. Please let me explain. You don't understand what you saw. But Garrett's response would be swift and cutting. We understand perfectly. Dad deserves better than this. And that's when Mary would realize the terrible truth. Her sons had seen Dominic. They'd seen them together. And they'd jumped to the worst possible conclusion. A conclusion she could understand even as it destroyed her, because from the outside, without context, without explanation, she knew exactly what it must have looked like. Before we continue with what happened next, I need to ask you something. Have you ever made an assumption about someone you love, only to find out later you were completely wrong? Have you ever seen something that looked one way but meant something entirely different? Drop your answer in the comments below, because Mary's story is about to show us just how dangerous assumptions can be. And if you're invested in finding out what Mary was really doing with that mysterious man, if you want to know the truth that her sons missed, then make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. Because this story is about to take turns you won't see coming, and you won't want to miss a single moment. Mary Henderson had no idea as she sat in her living room trying to compose herself, that she'd just lost her sons. She had no idea that they were, at that very moment, blocking her number, deciding she'd betrayed their father's memory, choosing to cut her out of their lives. She had no idea that the truth she was trying to honor would be the very thing that would tear her family apart. And she had no idea that by the time her sons finally learned what was really happening that day, it would be too late to take back the damage they were about to do. The clock on Mary's mantle ticked forward, each second bringing her closer to a nightmare she didn't even know was coming. Dominic gathered his papers, preparing to leave, reminding her to think about everything they'd discussed and to call him when she'd made her decision. Mary nodded, walking him to the door, thanking him for his patience and his kindness during such a difficult process. Neither of them knew that Garrett had been there. Neither of them knew that a single photograph taken out of context was about to destroy everything Mary had left in this world. As Dominic's car pulled away and Mary closed the door, her phone began to buzz. And Mary's world began to end. Mary's phone didn't just buzz. It exploded. Message after message lit up the screen in rapid succession, each notification sound like a knife to her heart. She picked it up with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the words that appeared faster than she could process them. From Garrett, I can't believe you'd do this to Dad. From Elliot, were you ever going to tell us? From Garrett again, how long has this been going on? From Elliot, we trusted you. Mary's confusion was absolute. Her mind raced, trying to understand what her sons were talking about, why they were suddenly attacking her with these messages. And then as she scrolled up, she saw it. The photo. A photo of her and Dominic on the couch, his hand over hers, her tears visible even in the grainy quality of a quickly snapped picture. Horror washed over her like ice water. No. They thought, oh God, they thought she was. Her hands shook so violently she almost dropped the phone as she pulled up Garrett's contact and hit the call button. She pressed the phone to her ear, her heart hammering, her breath coming in short gasps. She needed to explain. She needed to tell them what was really happening. She needed to make them understand. The call didn't even ring. It went straight to a declined call screen. Garrett had rejected it. Her oldest son, her first baby, the boy she'd held in her arms 28 years ago, had just refused to hear her voice. Please, she whispered to no one, her voice breaking. Please, Garrett, pick up. She tried again. Declined again. Panic rising in her throat, Mary switched to Elliot's contact. Her younger son, her gentle boy who'd always been easier to talk to, who'd always been more understanding. Elliot would listen. Elliot had to listen. The phone rang once. Twice. 3 times. Then voicemail. Elliot's recorded voice cheerfully told her to leave a message after the beep. Elliot, honey, please call me back. Mary's voice cracked as she spoke into the void. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. That photo, it's not what you think. Please, baby, just call me back. Let me explain. She hung up and immediately switched to her text messages, her thumbs flying across the keyboard even as tears blurred her vision. Please let me explain. You don't understand what you saw. She sent it to both of them, then sat there staring at her phone, waiting for those 3 little dots that would indicate they were typing back. waiting for any sign that her boys would give her a chance to tell them the truth. Garrett's response came first, and each word felt like a physical blow. "We understand perfectly. Dad deserves better than this." Mary read those words once, twice, 3 times, and something inside her broke. A sound came out of her throat, something between a sob and a wail, raw and animal and utterly broken. Her legs gave out and she collapsed onto her couch, the same couch where she'd sat with Dominic just an hour earlier, the same couch where she'd sat with Vincent during his final days at home before the hospital stay that would be his last. She sobbed into the cushions, great heaving cries that shook her entire body. Her sons thought she'd betrayed their father. Her boys, the 2 people whose opinions mattered more to her than anyone else's in the world, thought she'd dishonored Vincent's memory. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was that she could understand why. Without context, without explanation, she knew exactly what that photo looked like. She knew what conclusions any loving son would draw from seeing their mother in what appeared to be an intimate moment with another man, in their father's house, wearing their father's clothes. But they were wrong. So terribly, devastatingly wrong. To understand just how wrong they were, you need to understand Mary's story. You need to understand what the past 2 years had been like for her. Vincent Henderson had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 3 years ago. The doctors had given him 6 months, maybe 8 if he was lucky. Vincent had fought for 18 months, enduring chemotherapy that ravaged his body, radiation that burned his skin, experimental treatments that offered hope before snatching it away again. He'd fought because he loved Mary, because he couldn't bear to leave her alone, because after 30 years of marriage, the thought of saying goodbye was unbearable for both of them. When he finally died 2 years ago on a rainy October morning, Mary felt like she died with him. The grief was physically painful, a constant ache in her chest that made it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to do anything except exist in the gaping hole his absence had left in her life. For months she barely functioned. He forgot to eat. She couldn't sleep in their bed, so she slept on the couch. She wore Vincent's clothes because they still smelled like him. She talked to his photos like he could hear her. Some days she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to keep living. Garrett and Elliot had been her lifeline during those dark months. They'd checked on her constantly, calling every day, visiting multiple times a week. They'd made sure she ate, made sure she showered, made sure she got out of the house occasionally. They'd been the reason she kept going when grief threatened to pull her under completely. But 3 weeks ago life had gotten busy for both of them. Garrett had landed a major marketing campaign at work, the kind of project that could make his career. Elliot had started seeing someone new, someone serious, and was caught up in that early relationship excitement. They'd both called less, visited less. Mary understood. She didn't begrudge them their lives, their happiness, their forward momentum. She'd been learning to be alone with her grief, learning to survive it without her sons as constant supports. It had been hard, so hard, but she'd been managing. Until today. Until they'd decided she was betraying Vincent. Until they'd cut her off completely based on a single photo and their own assumptions. Now, sobbing on her couch, Mary felt that old familiar pull of despair. The same despair she'd felt in those early months after Vincent's death, when living had seemed pointless. She'd fought so hard to climb out of that darkness, and now, with one misunderstanding, she was tumbling right back into it. The next 48 hours were a nightmare. Mary called Garrett 7 times the first day. Every call was declined. She called Elliot 9 times. Every single one went to voicemail. She left messages that became increasingly desperate, increasingly incoherent as panic and grief overwhelmed her. "Garrett, please, I'm begging you. Just give me 5 minutes to explain. Elliot, honey, you know me. You know I would never dishonor your father. Please just call me back. Boys, please. Please don't do this. I can't lose you too. I can't lose you both." But the silence from both of them was absolute. On the second day, Mary couldn't take it anymore. She got in her car, hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel, and drove to Garrett's apartment complex across town. She'd been there dozens of times, dropping off food she'd made for him, helping him hang pictures, being the mother she'd always tried to be. She knocked on his door, her knuckles rapping urgently against the wood. "Garrett? Garrett, I know you're in there. Please, honey, just open the door. Just listen to me for 5 minutes." Silence. "Garrett, please." Her voice broke. "I'm your mother. I would never betray your father. You have to know that. You have to know me better than that. What Mary couldn't see was Garrett on the other side of that door, his eye pressed to the peephole, watching his mother fall apart in his hallway. She couldn't see the conflict on his face, the way his hand actually reached for the doorknob before he pulled it back. She couldn't see him close his eyes and lean his forehead against the door, listening to her pleas while forcing himself to stay silent. After 20 minutes of knocking and begging, Mary finally gave up. She walked back to her car on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment, climbed into the driver's seat, and sat there crying for another hour before she had the strength to drive home. The next day she tried Elliot's workplace. She knew his schedule, knew he'd be at the advertising firm where he worked as a junior copywriter. She drove downtown, found parking, and walked into the sleek modern building with its glass walls and expensive art. The receptionist, a young woman named Claire who'd always been friendly to Mary on her previous visits, gave her a sympathetic look that somehow made everything worse. "I'm here to see Elliot Henderson," Mary said, trying to keep her voice steady. Claire's expression shifted to discomfort. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Henderson. Elliot just stepped out." It was a lie. Mary could tell it was a lie from the way Claire couldn't quite meet her eyes, from the slight hesitation before she spoke. Elliot was there in the building, probably at his desk right now. He'd just told the receptionist not to let his mother through. "Could you tell him I'm here? Tell him I just need 5 minutes. Please." Claire looked genuinely distressed now. "I really can't. I'm sorry." Mary stood there for a long moment, understanding dawning. Her own son had instructed the receptionist to turn her away. Like she was some kind of stalker, some unwanted visitor to be barred from the premises. She turned and walked back to her car, and this time she sat there for hours. She sat there watching the building's entrance, hoping to catch Elliot when he left, hoping for just a chance to explain. The parking meter expired. A ticket was placed on her windshield. She didn't even notice. As the afternoon turned to evening and the sun began to set, Mary finally accepted that Elliot wasn't coming out. He was probably waiting for her to leave, maybe even watching from a window to make sure she was gone before he felt safe to exit the building. Her own son was treating her like a threat. Mary's hands were shaking constantly now. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a full meal. Dark circles had formed under her eyes, purple shadows that made her look 10 years older. She'd stopped showering, stopped caring about her appearance, stopped caring about much of anything except reaching her sons. At night, alone in her too quiet house, memories assaulted her. She'd remember Garrett as a little boy, maybe 6 years old, scraped knee from falling off his bike. Vincent had been teaching him to ride without training wheels in their driveway, running alongside him, catching him when he wobbled. But that day, Garrett had fallen, and he'd cried not from pain but from embarrassment that he couldn't do it right. Mary had scooped him up, held him close, and whispered, "Brave boys can cry too. And my boy is the bravest I know." Garrett had hugged her so tight, his small arms around her neck, his tears wet against her shoulder. "I love you, Mommy." She'd remember Elliot at 8 years old, coming to her after a fight with a friend at school. He'd been so upset, so convinced that his friend hated him over some minor playground disagreement. Mary had sat with him on this very couch, had explained that sometimes people we love hurt us without meaning to, and that forgiveness and communication were how we fixed those hurts. "Always talk it out," she told him. "Never let anger make decisions for you." And now here she was, unable to reach either of her sons, unable to explain, unable to make them understand. The irony was almost funny, except nothing about this situation was remotely funny. One evening, Mary set the dinner table for 3, just like she used to when the boys would visit regularly. She made pot roast, Garrett's favorite, and garlic mashed potatoes that Elliot had always loved. She set out plates and silverware, poured water into glasses, put everything out just so. Then she sat down at her place and stared at the 2 empty chairs. The food grew cold. No one came. No one was going to come. Mary put her head down on the table and cried until she had nothing left. If you're watching this and you've ever been cut off by someone you love, if you've ever experienced that special kind of pain that comes from being shut out by family, drop a comment and let me know. Because what happened to Mary next is going to show us just how far that pain can push a person. And if you want to find out what breaks Mary even further, what truth she's been trying to tell her sons, and whether this family can possibly survive this fracture, then you need to subscribe right now. Hit that button because this story is about to go somewhere you're not expecting, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. By day 4, Mary hadn't showered in 72 hours. She was wearing the same clothes she'd worn when Dominic had visited, including Vincent's cardigan that she clutched around herself like armor. She hadn't eaten anything substantial, just picked at crackers occasionally when her stomach hurt too much to ignore. Her phone sat on the coffee table in front of her, and she stared at it like it might suddenly spring to life with a call from her sons. It didn't. It just sat there, silent and accusatory, a constant reminder that the two people she loved most in the world wanted nothing to do with her. She'd stopped leaving voicemails. She'd stopped texting. What was the point? They'd made their decision. They'd seen what they'd seen, drawn their conclusions and convicted her without trial. Mary didn't know how much time had passed when she heard knocking at her door. She barely registered it at first, her mind foggy from lack of food and sleep. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, followed by a familiar voice. Mary? Mary, I know you're in there. Open this door right now. Bryn. Mary's best friend of 23 years, the woman who'd held Mary's hand through Vincent's diagnosis, through his treatment, through his death. Bryn, who took no nonsense from anyone and loved with a fierceness that could be intimidating. Mary didn't move. She didn't have the energy to move. The knocking continued, then stopped. Mary heard the sound of keys jingling. She'd forgotten that she'd given Bryn a spare key years ago for emergencies. Apparently, Bryn had decided this qualified as an emergency. The door opened and Bryn's voice called out, Mary? Where are you? Footsteps through the house, quick and purposeful. Then Bryn appeared in the living room doorway and Mary heard her sharp intake of breath. Bryn was in her late 50s, with short silver hair she wore with pride and the kind of direct gaze that made people either love her or avoid her entirely. Right now, that gaze was taking in Mary's appearance. The darkened room with curtains drawn against the afternoon sun, the general air of decay and despair. Jesus, Mary, Bryn breathed, crossing the room quickly. She knelt in front of the couch, her hands reaching for Mary's face, tilting it up to get a better look. What happened? You haven't answered your phone in 3 days. I've been worried sick. Mary's voice came out as a croak, barely audible. Why, boys? What about them? Bryn's tone was gentle now, her earlier sharpness softened by concern. And then, like a dam breaking, it all came pouring out. Mary told her everything. About Dominic's visit, about the photo Garrett had taken, about the messages and the accusations. About how she tried to explain and been shut out completely. About how her sons thought she'd betrayed Vincent, thought she'd dishonored his memory, thought she was capable of moving on so quickly from the man she'd loved for 30 years. As Mary spoke, her voice rose and fell, breaking on certain words, speeding up and slowing down as waves of emotion overtook her. Bryn listened without interrupting, one hand still on Mary's face, the other gripping her trembling hands. When Mary finally fell silent, exhausted from the telling, Bryn was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, Mary, what was Dominic Keller doing here? What were those papers you were looking at? Mary's eyes welled with fresh tears. Dominic isn't. He's not what they think. He's. But she couldn't finish the sentence. A fresh sob tore from her throat and she doubled over, the weight of everything crushing down on her all over again. Bryn pulled Mary into her arms, holding her like a child as she cried. When the storm of tears finally subsided into exhausted hiccups, Bryn pulled back and looked Mary dead in the eyes. You need to tell them the truth. Right now. Today. Whatever Dominic was really there for, whatever those papers really were, you need to make your sons understand. Mary shook her head weakly. They won't listen. They blocked my number. They won't see me. They think I betrayed Vincent, Bryn. My own sons think I'm capable of that. Then I'll tell them, Bryn said firmly, already pulling out her phone. Mary's hand shot out, grabbing Bryn's arm with surprising strength. No. Bryn looked at her in disbelief. Mary, you can't just let them think. No, Mary repeated, more forcefully this time. They need to come to me. If I force this, if I make you tell them or if I ambush them with the truth, it'll make everything worse. They'll feel manipulated. They'll feel like I'm making excuses. Mary, they're destroying you. Look at yourself. You haven't eaten, you haven't showered, you're falling apart. They need to choose to listen, Mary insisted, her voice taking on a desperate edge. They need to choose to trust me, to give me a chance. If I force it, even if they learn the truth, they'll never forgive themselves for how they treated me. It'll poison everything. I know my boys, Bryn. I know how their minds work. They need to come to this realization on their own. Bryn stared at her for a long moment, concern and frustration warring on her face. And what if they don't? What if they never give you that chance? What if you just sit here waiting for them to come around while you waste away? Mary didn't have an answer for that. Because the truth was she didn't know what she'd do if her sons never spoke to her again. She didn't know if she could survive losing them on top of losing Vincent. She didn't know if she had the strength to keep living in a world where the 3 people she loved most were all gone, even if 2 of them were still alive. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel, right next to Vincent's photo. Vincent, who would know what to do right now. Vincent, who had always been so good at talking to the boys, at making them see reason, at bridging gaps and healing wounds. But Vincent was gone. And Mary was here alone, drowning in a misunderstanding that was growing bigger and more devastating with every passing hour. What Mary didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that time was running out. That her body, already weakened from grief and now pushed to the breaking point by stress and starvation, was reaching its limits. That the choice she was making to wait for her sons to come to her would have consequences she couldn't possibly foresee. And what her sons didn't know as they went about their lives trying to process their anger and hurt, trying to reconcile the mother they'd known with the mother they thought they'd discovered, was that their silence was doing damage that might soon become irreversible. The clock kept ticking. The phone stayed silent. And in her dark living room, Mary Henderson sat with her grief and her secrets, waiting for sons who might never come. But while Mary was falling apart in her darkened house, her sons were going through their own battles. Because cutting off your mother, even when you think she's betrayed everything you hold sacred, isn't as simple as blocking a number and moving on. The human heart doesn't work that way. And Garrett Henderson was discovering that the hard way. 4 days after he'd taken that photo, Garrett sat at his desk at the marketing firm where he worked, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it. The presentation he was supposed to be preparing for a major client pitch sat untouched, the cursor blinking mockingly at him from a blank slide. His hand kept drifting to his phone. He'd pull it out, unlock it, and there it was. That photo. He must have looked at it 100 times by now, maybe more. Each time he searched for something he might have missed, some detail that would make it make sense in a way that didn't break his heart. But every time, all he saw was his mother holding hands with a stranger, crying with a stranger, sharing an intimate moment with a stranger in the house where his father had died. His mother was wearing his father's cardigan. That detail haunted him more than anything else. What kind of woman wore her dead husband's clothes while entertaining another man? Garrett. He jumped, nearly dropping his phone. Sloane stood in the doorway of his office, concern written across her face. His girlfriend of 8 months, with her sharp mind and sharper observations, had been watching him spiral for days now, and her patience was clearly wearing thin. "You've been off for days," she said, closing the door behind her and perching on the edge of his desk. "What's going on? And don't tell me it's work stress. I know what work stress looks like on you, and this isn't it." Garrett opened his mouth to deflect, to make some excuse, but he was so tired. Tired of carrying this anger, tired of the weight of betrayal, tired of pretending everything was fine when his world had tilted on its axis. He handed her his phone without a word, the photo already pulled up on the screen. Sloane took the phone, her eyes narrowing as she studied the image. She was quiet for a long moment, her thumbs scrolling, zooming in on different parts of the picture. Garrett watched her face, waiting for the same shock and anger he'd felt, waiting for validation that his response had been justified. But when Sloane looked up, her expression wasn't what he expected. "Garrett," she said slowly, carefully, "they're looking at papers. There are documents spread out on the coffee table." "So what?" Garrett's voice came out more defensive than he intended. "That doesn't change what I saw." "What did you see exactly?" Sloane's tone was gentle but probing, the way she talked when she was trying to get him to think through a problem logically instead of emotionally. "I saw my mom holding hands with some guy I've never met. I saw her crying with him, sitting close to him, having some kind of intimate moment while wearing my dad's clothes." The words tumbled out, each one laced with hurt. Sloane tilted her head, still studying the photo. "Or you saw your mom having an emotional conversation with someone while reviewing what looks like legal documents." "Garrett, his briefcase is right there on the floor. He's wearing a full suit. This looks like a business meeting." "Business meetings don't involve holding hands," Garrett snapped. "They do when someone is going through something difficult," Sloane countered. My lawyer held my hand when we were going through my dad's estate paperwork after he died. Sometimes people need comfort during hard conversations. Garrett stood up abruptly, taking his phone back from her. You don't understand. You didn't see the way they were sitting. You didn't see. Your mom, who was devoted to your dad for 30 years? Sloane interrupted, her voice rising slightly. The woman who barely left his hospital bedside during those final months? The mother who fell apart so completely after he died that you and Elliot had to take turns staying with her to make sure she ate? That mom. People change, Garrett said, but his voice lacked conviction. Do they? Sloane stood up too, facing him directly. Or do we see what we expect to see, what we're afraid of seeing, and jump to conclusions without getting the full story? I know what I saw, Sloane. Maybe you should actually talk to her, Sloane said softly. Maybe you should give her a chance to explain before you completely cut her out of your life. Garrett felt something hot and defensive rise in his chest. She had 2 years to move on properly. 2 years. And this is how she honors Dad's memory? By sneaking around with some stranger in his house. You don't know that she's sneaking around. You don't know anything because you haven't asked. Sloane's frustration was showing now. Garrett, I love you, but you're being stubborn and unfair. Your mom deserves a chance to explain. She's the one who should have explained before we had to find out this way, Garrett shot back. Sloane stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head. Find out what, exactly? You still haven't told me what you think you found out. All you've told me is that you saw your mom with someone. That's it. That's all you actually know. She moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. I'm going back to my desk. When you're ready to stop being angry long enough to think clearly, you know where to find me. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Garrett was alone again with his thoughts and his phone and that damn photo. He sat back down heavily, Sloane's words echoing in his mind. Legal documents. Briefcase. Business suit. His mom who'd been devoted to his dad for 3 decades. His mom who'd fallen apart so completely after Vincent died that Garrett had genuinely worried she might not survive the grief. Could he have been wrong? The thought sent a spike of something uncomfortable through his chest. Not quite guilt, not yet, but something close to it. A whisper of doubt that had been there since the beginning but that he'd pushed down under layers of anger and hurt. Against his will, memories started flooding back. Not the easy ones, not the happy childhood moments, but the hard ones. The ones from 2 years ago. His father in that hospital bed, skin yellow from the cancer ravaging his liver, body so thin that he barely looked human anymore. And his mother sitting in the chair beside him, holding his hand exactly the way she'd been holding that stranger's hand in the photo. She'd sat there for 16 hours a day, only leaving when Garrett or Elliot forced her to go home and sleep for a few hours. Vincent had been unconscious for most of those final days, lost in a morphine haze that kept the pain at bay but took him away from them in the process. But Mary had talked to him anyway. Garrett had stood outside the hospital room once, listening to his mother's voice as she told Vincent about her day, about what the boys were doing, about how much she loved him. I don't know how to do this without you, she'd whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know how to live in a world where you're not here. When Vincent had finally died, Mary had let out a sound that Garrett would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. A keening wail of pure agony, the sound of a heart shattering into pieces so small they might never be put back together. At the funeral she'd been almost catatonic. She'd stared at the casket with empty eyes, and when people had tried to comfort her, she'd looked right through them. It had taken months before she'd started to resemble the mother Garrett had known before cancer had stolen his father. Was that woman, that utterly devoted wife who'd loved her husband with every fiber of her being, really capable of moving on so quickly? Of dishonoring Vincent's memory just 2 years later? Garrett's hand hovered over his phone. His thumb moved to his favorites list, found his mom's contact. Mary Henderson. With the photo he'd taken of her at Christmas last year, smiling while holding a ridiculous ugly sweater Elliot had given her as a gag gift. He could call her. Right now. He could just ask her what was going on. Give her a chance to explain. His finger hovered over the call button. But then that image flashed through his mind again. The stranger's hand over his mother's. Her tears. The intimacy of the moment. And the anger rushed back, hot and protective and righteous. She was the one who'd done something wrong. She was the one who owed them an explanation. Not the other way around. Garrett locked his phone and shoved it in his pocket, turning back to his computer with determination. He had work to do. He couldn't keep obsessing over this. But even as he tried to focus on his presentation, doubt gnawed at him. A small voice in the back of his mind that sounded uncomfortably like Sloane asking, "What if you're wrong?" Across town, Elliot Henderson was having his own crisis of conscience, though he'd die before admitting it. He sat in his apartment living room, his third beer of the evening sweating condensation onto the coffee table beside him. The photo was pulled up on his phone, which sat propped against the beer bottle, like some kind of terrible shrine to his mother's betrayal. His roommate Trevor emerged from his bedroom, took one look at Elliot's setup and sighed. "Dude, you're still staring at that thing." "Observant as always," Elliot muttered, taking another swig of beer. Trevor dropped onto the couch beside him, his expression a mix of concern and exasperation. "Hey, what's going on? And I mean really going on, because you've been in this mood for days and it's starting to worry me." Elliot laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My mom is already with someone else. Like Dad never mattered. Like 30 years of marriage means nothing. Like 2 years is plenty of time to just move on and find someone new." The words came out bitter, each one coated with the pain he'd been carrying since Garrett had sent him that photo. Trevor was quiet for a moment, then reached over and picked up Elliot's phone, studying the image. "Have you actually talked to her about it? What's there to talk about?" Elliot grabbed his phone back. Garrett saw them together. He took a picture. "The evidence is right there." "Garrett saw something," Trevor corrected carefully. "That doesn't mean he saw everything. Context matters, man." Elliot felt anger flare in his chest, hot and defensive. "Whose side are you on?" "I'm on your side, you idiot," Trevor said, but his voice was gentle. "I'm always on your side. That's why I'm telling you that you might be making a mistake here. Your mom has been nothing but devoted to you and Garrett since your dad died. Hell, before he died too. You've told me stories about how she basically became a saint, taking care of your dad through his treatment, never complaining, never asking for anything." "Yeah, well, people change," Elliot said, but even to his own ears it sounded weak. "Or people grieve in complicated ways," Trevor suggested. "Or maybe, and I'm just throwing this out there, maybe there's an explanation for what Garrett saw that has nothing to do with your mom dating someone." Elliot shook his head stubbornly. "You didn't see the picture. The way they were sitting. The way he was touching her hand." "I'm looking at the picture right now," Trevor pointed out. "And I see two people looking at what appears to be paperwork. I see someone comforting someone else who's clearly upset. I don't see anything that screams affair, or betrayal, or whatever you think is happening." "You don't know what you're talking about," Elliot snapped, standing abruptly. His beer bottle tipped and he caught it just before it spilled. "You don't know my mom. You don't know what this would do to my dad's memory." "You're right, I don't know your mom," Trevor agreed. "But I know you. And I know you're going to regret this if you don't at least talk to her." Elliot didn't respond. He couldn't, because part of him knew Trevor was right, and that made him even angrier. He grabbed his keys from the hook by the door and stormed out of the apartment, ignoring Trevor's call of, "Where are you going?" He didn't have an answer to that question. He just knew he needed to move, needed to drive, needed to do something other than sit in his apartment drowning in beer and doubt and anger that was starting to feel less righteous and more confused with every passing hour. Elliot drove with no destination in mind, just following roads on autopilot while his mind spun in circles. His phone buzzed in his pocket multiple times, probably Trevor checking on him, but he ignored it. What if Trevor was right? What if there was an explanation? What if his mom had been trying to tell them something important, and they'd shut her out before she could explain? But then again, what explanation could possibly justify what Garrett had seen? What innocent reason could there be for holding hands with a strange man, for crying with him, for having what was clearly some kind of emotional, intimate moment? Elliot's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he drove, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. He wasn't paying attention to where he was going until he found himself on a familiar street. His childhood street. The road that led to the house where he'd grown up, where his dad had taught him to ride a bike and throw a baseball, where his mom had made countless dinners and bandaged countless scraped knees. The house came into view and Elliot's foot automatically lifted off the gas pedal. The lights were on inside, warm yellow glowing through the windows. His mom was home. Of course she was home. Where else would she be? For a wild moment, Elliot almost turned into the driveway. Almost parked his car and marched up to that door and demanded answers. Demanded to know what was going on, who that man was, what right she thought she had to move on so quickly from the man who'd loved her for 3 decades. His hands moved the wheel slightly, ready to make the turn. But at the last second something stopped him. Pride maybe. Or anger. Or fear of what he might hear if he actually gave her the chance to explain. Fear that the explanation might make sense, might force him to confront the possibility that he and Garrett had been wrong, had hurt their mother for no good reason. Elliot's foot pressed back down on the gas and he drove past the house without stopping. In his rearview mirror he could see the lights growing smaller and he told himself he'd made the right choice. Told himself his mother was the one who should reach out, who should explain herself without being confronted. But as the house disappeared from view and he continued driving aimlessly through the night, that small voice of doubt grew louder. The voice that sounded like Trevor, like Sloane, like his own conscience trying to tell him something he wasn't ready to hear. Have you ever been so convinced you were right about something that you ignored all the evidence suggesting otherwise? Have you ever held on to anger because admitting you might be wrong felt too scary, too dangerous? Drop your thoughts in the comments because what's about to happen to Mary is going to show us exactly why that kind of stubbornness can have devastating consequences. And if you want to see how this family's story ends, if you want to know what truth Mary has been trying to tell her sons, then you need to subscribe right now. Because what happens next will break your heart before it has any chance of being put back together. Hit that subscribe button, because you won't want to miss a single moment of what's coming. While her sons drove through the night wrestling with doubt and anger, while Garrett stared at his blank computer screen and Elliot circled their childhood neighborhood, Mary was alone in her house, spiraling toward a catastrophe no one saw coming. It had been 3 days since she'd eaten anything more substantial than a few crackers. 3 days of waiting for her phone to ring, for her sons to reach out, for some miracle that would let her explain the truth they so desperately needed to hear. Bryn had left hours ago after making Mary promise to eat something, to take care of herself, to not give up. Mary had promised, had nodded and agreed to everything Bryn had said, but the moment her friend's car had pulled out of the driveway, Mary had gone right back to her vigil on the couch. She sat in the growing darkness, not bothering to turn on lights as the sun set. Her head ached, a dull throb that had been building for hours. Her hands still shook, a constant tremor that made even simple tasks feel insurmountable. She needed to use the bathroom. It was such a simple thing, such a basic human need, but it felt like an enormous effort to stand up from the couch. Mary placed her hands on the armrests and pushed herself upward, and the world immediately tilted. Vertigo slammed into her like a physical force. The room spun violently, and her vision went dark at the edges, narrowing to a tunnel that rapidly closed in on itself. She tried to catch herself, tried to reach for the couch, but her legs gave out completely. Mary's body fell, and on the way down, the corner of the coffee table rushed up to meet her. The impact was sharp and violent, a crack that echoed through the quiet house. Pain exploded through her skull, white-hot and all-consuming, and then she was on the floor, her cheek pressed against the cold hardwood. For a moment she couldn't understand what had happened. The world was a jumble of sensation. Pain in her head, the hard floor beneath her, wetness spreading beneath her face. Was she crying? No, this was different. This was warm and sticky and blood. She was bleeding. Mary tried to move, tried to push herself up, but her arms wouldn't cooperate. They felt distant, disconnected, like they belonged to someone else. She managed to lift her head slightly and immediately regretted it as nausea rolled through her and the room spun even more violently. Her phone. Where was her phone? Mary's vision was blurry, but she could just make out the shape of her phone across the room, sitting on the kitchen counter where she'd left it after her last futile attempt to call Garrett. It might as well have been a mile away. She tried to crawl toward it. Her hands scrabbled against the floor, slipping in the blood that was pooling beneath her head. She made it maybe 6 inches before exhaustion overwhelmed her and she collapsed again, her cheek hitting the floor with another jolt of pain. Her vision was getting darker now, the edges closing in more with each passing second. Mary knew with a distant clarity that this was bad. This was really bad. She needed help. She needed someone to call an ambulance to get her to a hospital. She needed her sons. Garrett, she whispered, the word barely audible even to her own ears. Elliot. Please. But there was no one to hear her. No one to help. She'd sent Bryn away. Her neighbors were distant, separated by large yards and privacy fences. And her sons, the two people who would have come running at the first sign she was in trouble, had no idea anything was wrong. Because she'd told Bryn not to call them. Because she'd insisted they needed to come to her on their own. Because she'd been so certain that forcing the truth would make things worse. Mary's breath came in short, shallow gasps. The pool of blood beneath her head was growing larger. Her phone, her lifeline to the world, remained impossibly out of reach across the room. She tried once more to move, to crawl, to do something, anything to save herself. But her body wouldn't respond. It had reached its absolute limit, pushed beyond endurance by grief and stress and starvation. Mary's eyes drifted to the mantel, to Vincent's photo smiling down at her. She thought about the last thing he'd said to her before he'd slipped into that final morphine haze. Take care of our boys. And let them take care of you. She'd failed. She'd failed Vincent, failed her sons, failed herself. As consciousness began to slip away, Mary's last coherent thought was a desperate prayer. Please let someone find me. Please don't let this be how it ends. Please give me one more chance to tell my sons the truth. The room grew darker. The pain faded to a distant throb. And Mary Henderson, alone in the house where she'd built a life with Vincent, where she'd raised two boys who no longer spoke to her, where she'd been trying desperately to honor her late husband's final wishes, slowly lost consciousness. The blood continued to pool beneath her head. Her phone continued to sit uselessly on the kitchen counter. And somewhere out in the night, her two sons continued to drive and work and rage, completely unaware that their mother was dying on her living room floor. The clock on the mantel ticked forward. Each second precious. Each second potentially Mary's last. And no one knew. No one was coming. Not yet. The call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon. Garrett was back at his desk, still staring at the same presentation he'd been unable to complete for days, when his phone began to ring. The number wasn't in his contacts. Unknown caller. Normally he'd let it go to voicemail, assume it was spam, ignore it completely. But something made him answer. Maybe instinct. Maybe fate. Maybe just dumb luck. Hello. Is this Garrett Henderson? The voice on the other end was female, professional, with that particular tone that healthcare workers develop. The one that's calm but carries an undercurrent of urgency. Yes, this is Garrett. A cold feeling began to spread through his chest, though he didn't yet know why. Mr. Henderson, this is Connecticut Valley Hospital. We have Mary Henderson here listed as an emergency contact. Your mother collapsed at home. A neighbor found her and called 911. She's currently in our emergency department. The world stopped. Garrett's face drained of all color. The phone nearly slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers. What? What happened? Is she okay? She's stable now, but you should come to the hospital as soon as possible. We're in the emergency department, 3rd floor. Ask for her. But Garrett was already moving. He grabbed his jacket, his keys, his phone pressed to his ear as he bolted for the door of his office. Sloane looked up from her desk as he passed, concern flashing across her face, but he couldn't stop to explain. I'm on my way, he said into the phone, his voice shaking. I'm coming right now. The hospital worker was saying something else, but Garrett had already hung up. His fingers were trembling so badly he could barely navigate his contacts list. When he finally found Elliot's number and pressed call, it felt like the phone rang for an eternity before his brother answered. What? Elliot's voice was short, still carrying the edge of anger from their last conversation. Mom's in the hospital. The words came out in a rush, tripping over each other. She collapsed. A neighbor found her. We need to go now. Right now, Elliot. There was a beat of silence, and then Elliot's voice came back, stripped of all anger, filled only with fear. I'm leaving now. Which hospital? Connecticut Valley. Emergency department, 3rd floor. I'll meet you there. Both brothers drove like madmen through the afternoon traffic, hearts pounding, minds racing with worst-case scenarios. Garrett's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every red light felt like torture. Every slow driver an obstacle between him and his mother. She collapsed. Those words kept echoing in his mind. His mother had collapsed. Was alone. A neighbor had found her. How long had she been lying there? How bad was it? And underneath all those questions, darker ones lurked. Questions he didn't want to ask but couldn't avoid. When was the last time he'd checked on her? When was the last time either of them had made sure she was okay? For days. How long had they left her completely alone while they nursed their anger and their wounded pride? Elliot's drive was equally frantic, equally consumed by guilt that was rapidly replacing anger. His mother had collapsed. His mother who'd been trying to reach them for days. His mother who'd left increasingly desperate voicemails that he'd deleted without listening to. His mother who'd shown up at his workplace and been turned away like an unwanted solicitor. What had they done? Both brothers arrived at the hospital within minutes of each other, meeting in the parking lot by pure chance. They looked at each other and for the first time in days the anger between them was gone, replaced by something more terrible, shared guilt and shared fear. They didn't speak as they ran toward the entrance. There was nothing to say. Not yet. The emergency department was a maze of white walls and antiseptic smells, and that particular hospital sound, that mixture of beeping monitors and distant conversations and the occasional overhead page. Garrett approached the nurse's station with Elliot right behind him, both of them breathless from their sprint through the parking lot. Mary Henderson, Garrett managed to get out. Our mother. We were called. She collapsed. The nurse checked her computer, her expression neutral in that professional way that gave nothing away. She's in Bay 7. I'll let the doctor know you're here. You can wait in the family waiting area just down that hall. The waiting area was a small room with uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines and a television playing some daytime talk show that neither brother registered. They sat down side by side and then there was nothing to do but wait. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating. Garrett stared at his hands. Elliot stared at the wall. Both of them were thinking the same thing, feeling the same crushing weight of guilt that made it hard to breathe. Minutes crawled by like hours. Other families came and went. A woman with a crying baby. An elderly man with a cane. A teenage girl with her arm in a makeshift sling. But Garrett and Elliot just sat there, trapped in their own private hell of what-ifs and if-onlys. Finally, a nurse appeared in the doorway. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. She looked at them both, and something in her expression made Garrett's stomach clench. "You're Mary Henderson's sons?" They both stood immediately, nodding. "She's stable," the nurse said, and both brothers released breaths they didn't know they'd been holding. "But she's in serious condition. She had severe dehydration, malnutrition, and a concussion from hitting her head when she fell. We've got her on 4 fluids and we're monitoring her closely." Severe dehydration. Malnutrition. The words hit Garrett like physical blows. How long has she been alone?" he managed to ask, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. The nurse's expression shifted to something that looked like judgment, though she kept her voice neutral. "Based on her condition, I'd say at least 3 or 4 days without adequate food or water." "How long has she been living alone?" Garrett's voice came out as barely a whisper. 3 days. She's been alone for 3 days. Because of us." The nurse's eyes widened slightly and Elliot felt compelled to explain, to justify, to make this somehow not as bad as it sounded. "We had a misunderstanding. We weren't speaking to her. We didn't know." "You didn't know your mother wasn't eating or drinking?" The nurse's tone was still professional, but there was an edge to it now. "No one was checking on her?" Neither brother could answer. What could they say? That they'd been too angry to check? Too hurt to care? Too stubborn to listen when she tried to explain? The nurse sighed and her expression softened slightly. "She's asking for you. Both of you. She's been in and out of consciousness, but every time she wakes up she asks for her sons. You can go in now. Bay 7 just down this hall on the right." Garrett and Elliot walked down that hallway like men heading to their own execution. Each step felt impossibly heavy. Each breath felt inadequate. They'd been so angry, so convinced they were right, so certain their mother had betrayed them. And all this time she'd been falling apart and they'd been too stubborn to see it. Bay 7 had a curtain partially drawn across it. Through the gap they could see a hospital bed, medical equipment, the steady beep of monitors. Neither brother wanted to pull that curtain back. Neither wanted to see what they'd done. But they had to. They owed her that much at least. Garrett reached out with a shaking hand and pulled the curtain aside. The woman in the bed barely looked like their mother. Mary lay unconscious, her face pale and drawn, making the dark circles under her eyes look like bruises. And 4 line ran into her arm, pumping fluids into her dehydrated body. A white bandage covered a portion of her head where she'd hit the coffee table, and even from the doorway, they could see the edges of a nasty bruise spreading from beneath it. But it was more than just the physical damage. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, like she'd been hollowed out from the inside. She looked like a woman who'd given up. Elliot made a sound, something between a sob and a gasp, and pressed his hand to his mouth. Garrett took a step into the room, then another, his eyes never leaving his mother's face. How had they not seen how much she was struggling? How had they been so blind? And then he saw it. A manila folder sitting on the small table beside her bed, the kind of folder that holds important documents. Legal papers, probably, given the thickness. Something made Garrett reach for it, his hands shaking so badly he almost knocked over the plastic water pitcher sitting next to it. Elliot moved to stand beside him as Garrett opened the folder, and both brothers stared down at the documents inside. Legal letterhead. Dominic Keller, attorney at law. Estate planning and trust services. Estate planning. Attorney. Not a boyfriend. Not an affair. An attorney. Garrett's hands shook harder as he pulled out the papers, scanning them with increasing horror as the truth revealed itself line by line, document by document. There, in official legal language, was a life insurance policy. Vincent Henderson, policy holder. Beneficiary, Mary Henderson. Death benefit, $340,000. Policy maturation date, 2 months ago. $340,000. A secret life insurance policy that Vincent had taken out years ago, that Mary had known nothing about until after his death. And there, beneath the policy documents, was a letter. Handwritten on Vincent's personal stationery, dated 2 weeks before he died. The handwriting was shaky, evidence of how weak he'd been by then, but still unmistakably his. Garrett's vision blurred with tears as he began to read, but his voice wouldn't work. He handed the letter to Elliot with trembling hands, unable to speak, unable to process what he was seeing. Elliot took the letter, and his voice shook as he began to read aloud. "My dearest Mary, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're meeting with Dominic about the insurance policy. I know this will come as a surprise. I'm sorry for keeping it from you, but I needed to know you'd be taken care of after I was gone. The money from this policy is for you, for your security, for your peace of mind. I never wanted you to worry about finances, to stress about making ends meet, to have to downsize from the house where we raised our boys. This money means you won't have to. But I know you, my love. I know you'll want to do something meaningful with it. Something that honors what we went through. So I have a request, not a demand, but a hope. Use some of this money to create a scholarship fund. For children whose parents are fighting cancer. For families who are going through what we went through. Help them pay for college, for books, for a future that might feel impossible when you're watching a parent die. Call it the Vincent Henderson Memorial Scholarship if you want, or don't. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that some good comes from all this pain. What matters is that our suffering means something. Take care of yourself, Mary. Take care of our boys. You're stronger than you know, but you'll need them and they'll need you. Don't let them face the world alone, and don't you face it alone either. I love you. I will always love you. Every day for 30 years was a gift, and I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Take care of our mother, boys. She's the best of us. Forever yours, Vincent." Elliot's voice broke on the last line. The letter fell from his hands and drifted to the floor as he collapsed into the chair beside Mary's bed, his face in his hands, shoulders shaking with sobs. Garrett stood frozen, the other documents still clutched in his hands. He forced himself to keep reading, to understand the full scope of what they'd missed, what they'd been so wrong about. More papers. Documents outlining the Vincent Henderson Memorial Scholarship Trust. Papers showing that Mary had been working with Dominic Keller to set up the trust properly, to make sure it would continue giving scholarships for years to come. Financial forms. Legal agreements. All the bureaucratic necessities of turning Vincent's final wish into reality. And then, tucked between two official documents, Garrett found another letter. This one in Mary's handwriting, dated the day before Garrett had taken that photo. An unsent letter to him and Elliot. "Dear Garrett and Elliot, I've been trying to find the right time to tell you about your father's insurance policy and the scholarship trust. I wanted to do it in person to show you his letter, to explain how much thought he put into this. Meeting with Dominic has been harder than I expected. Every time I read your father's words, I fall apart all over again. It's like losing him again, but it's also like having him back for just a moment. Like hearing his voice one more time. I know you've both been busy with work and life, and I'm so proud of you both. You don't need to worry about me so much. I'm learning to be okay. Some days are harder than others, but I'm managing. The scholarship fund will be your father's legacy. It will help families going through what we went through. I think it will help me heal, knowing that his suffering had a purpose, that it can prevent other families from facing the same financial stress on top of the emotional trauma. I love you both more than words can express. You are the best things your father and I ever created together. Garrett's knees gave out. He sank into the other chair beside Mary's bed, the letter crumpling in his grip. She'd been trying to tell them. She'd been trying to share this with them. And they'd shut her out. They'd blocked her calls. They'd refused to listen. They'd let her waste away alone in that house because they were so convinced they knew what they'd seen. Dominic Keller wasn't her boyfriend. He was her attorney, helping her honor Vincent's final wish. The papers they'd been reviewing weren't romantic correspondence. They were legal documents for a scholarship fund in Vincent's name. The hand-holding wasn't intimacy. It was comfort while she cried over her dead husband's last letter to her. And Mary's tears that day? They weren't tears of guilt or secret love. They were tears of grief, renewed and raw, because reading Vincent's words had broken her heart all over again. They'd been so completely, devastatingly wrong. "Oh God," Garrett whispered, his voice breaking. "Oh God, what did we do?" Elliot couldn't speak. He just shook his head back and forth, tears streaming down his face, one hand reaching out to grip Mary's pale, thin hand where it lay on the bed. They sat there in that hospital room, surrounded by the evidence of their mistake, the proof of their mother's innocence, the terrible truth that they'd abandoned her when she needed them most. They'd let their assumptions and their anger drive away the woman who'd given them life, who'd raised them with love, who'd been nothing but devoted to their father for 30 years. And she'd almost died because of it. If that neighbor hadn't checked on her. If she'd been alone just a few more hours. If help hadn't come when it did. They could have lost her. Forever. Without ever knowing the truth. Without ever making it right. The machines around Mary's bed beeped steadily, monitoring her heart rate, her oxygen levels, her slow recovery from the physical trauma of starvation and dehydration and grief. But the emotional trauma? The damage of being abandoned by her sons, of having them think the worst of her, of spending days calling and begging and being ignored? How did you monitor that kind of damage? How did you measure that kind of pain? Garrett reached out and took Mary's other hand, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. She looked so fragile lying there, so breakable. This was their mother. The woman who'd kissed their scraped knees and taught them to tie their shoes and stayed up all night when they were sick. The woman who'd held their father's hand through 18 months of hell and never once complained about her own pain. And they'd thought she was capable of betraying him. They'd thought she'd moved on after just 2 years, like 30 years of marriage meant nothing. "I'm so sorry," Garrett whispered to her unconscious form. "Mom, I'm so sorry. We were wrong. We were so wrong." Movement beside them made both brothers look up. Mary's eyes were fluttering, consciousness slowly returning. Her head moved slightly on the pillow and a small sound of pain escaped her lips. "Mom." Elliot leaned forward, his voice urgent and hopeful and terrified all at once. "Mom, can you hear us?" Mary's eyes opened slowly, struggling to focus. She blinked several times, confusion crossing her face as she took in the hospital room, the 4 in her arm, the bandage on her head. And then her gaze landed on her sons, both sitting beside her bed, both with tears streaming down their faces. For a moment she just stared at them like she couldn't quite believe they were real. "Garrett." Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Elliot." Garrett grabbed her hand with both of his, holding it like a lifeline. "Mom." "Oh God, Mom, I'm so sorry. We're so sorry." More confusion clouded Mary's eyes and then slowly understanding began to dawn. Her face crumpled and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "You thought." She managed to get out, her voice breaking. "You thought I was betraying him." "We were wrong," Elliot said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "We should have let you explain. We should have trusted you. We should have known you would never." "I tried to tell you," Mary whispered, and the pain in her voice was worse than any physical injury could have been. "I called and called." "We know," Garrett said, his voice thick with tears and guilt. "We know, and we were wrong. So terribly wrong. Mom, we found the papers. We found Dad's letter. We know about the insurance policy. We know about the scholarship trust. We know everything. Mary's eyes widened slightly. The trust, she said weakly. Your father wanted to help people. I needed Dominic to make it happen. To set it up properly. To make sure it would last. We saw the documents, Elliot said, unable to stop crying. We read Dad's letter. We read your letter to us, the one you never sent. When we failed you. When you needed us most, when you were trying to honor Dad's memory, we abandoned you. You saw the photo, Mary said, and there was understanding in her voice even through the pain. I understand why you thought. Without context, I know what it must have looked like. Don't make excuses for us, Garrett said fiercely. We should have asked. We should have given you a chance to explain. Instead, we blocked your calls. We refused to see you. We left you alone for days while you... His voice broke completely. You almost died, Mom. You almost died, and it would have been our fault. Have you ever realized too late that you were completely wrong about someone? Have you ever jumped to a conclusion that nearly destroyed a relationship with someone you love? Share your story in the comments, because Mary and her sons are about to show us what happens when we choose trust over assumptions, when we choose love over pride. And if you want to see how this family heals from this devastating mistake, if you want to know whether forgiveness is possible after this kind of hurt, then subscribe right now. Because what comes next is going to show you the power of family, the strength of love, and the possibility of redemption. Hit that subscribe button because this story isn't over yet. Mary looked at both of her sons, these two men she'd raised, these two pieces of her heart that were now breaking in front of her. She could see the guilt eating them alive, could see them trying to carry the weight of what they'd done. You came, she whispered, squeezing both their hands weakly. You're here now. We should have been here days ago, Elliot said. We should have been here the moment you tried to reach us. You're here now, Mary repeated, and despite everything, despite the pain and the near-death experience and the days of abandonment, there was forgiveness in her voice. That's what matters. You're here. But even as she said it, as she tried to comfort her sons even from her hospital bed, everyone in that room knew the truth. They were here now, yes. But they'd almost been too late. And that knowledge, that terrible awareness of how close they'd come to losing each other forever, would haunt all of them for a very long time. The machines continued to beep. The four continued to drip. And in that hospital room, a family began the long, painful process of putting itself back together after almost being destroyed by assumptions, pride, and the failure to communicate. But the question remained, could they truly heal from this? Could Mary forgive her sons for abandoning her? Could the sons forgive themselves for what they'd almost done? Only time would tell. 3 months have passed since that devastating confrontation in Mary Henderson's living room. 3 months since two sons learned the painful difference between what they thought they saw and what was actually happening. 3 months since a family nearly destroyed itself over assumptions. Today it's Sunday afternoon and Mary's home is alive again. Not with the tension and anger that once filled these walls, but with something far more precious. The sound of family coming back together. Mary stands in her kitchen, fully recovered from her stroke, moving with the energy and grace that had been stolen from her during those dark weeks. The medication is working. The physical therapy has done wonders. But more than anything, it's what happened after the truth came out that has truly healed her. The dining room table is set for 6. Garrett and his wife Sloane are already seated, their daughter playing quietly nearby. Elliot and Trevor have just arrived, carrying dessert and wearing genuine smiles. The kind that reach the eyes, the kind that come from relief and redemption. But there's something new in this house. Something that would make Vincent Henderson smile if he could see it. On the mantel, in a beautiful silver frame, sits a photograph of a young girl, maybe 16 years old, with bright eyes full of hope and determination. Her name is beneath the photo, along with the words, First recipient, Vincent Henderson Memorial Scholarship Trust. This girl's father died of cancer 2 years ago. Her family struggled just like so many others. And now, because of Vincent's life insurance policy, because of Mary's careful planning with Dominic Keller, this girl will go to college. She'll have opportunities her father dreamed of giving her but couldn't. She's the first, but she won't be the last. The scholarship trust that Mary established, the one Garrett and Elliot accused her of squandering their father's legacy to create, is now operational. Every year it will help young people whose families have been devastated by illness. Every year, Vincent's love will continue reaching beyond the grave, touching lives he never met, fulfilling the purpose he and Mary discussed in those final, precious conversations. The doorbell rings and Mary opens it to find Dominic Keller standing there with a warm smile and a manila folder. "Just dropping off the final paperwork, Mary," he says, stepping inside. "The trust is officially fully funded and registered. Your husband would be incredibly proud." Garrett and Elliot both stand as Dominic enters, and there's a moment, just a brief moment, where everyone remembers what these three people went through together. The accusations, the intervention, the truth that shattered everything they thought they knew. But Dominic doesn't hold grudges. He greets Garrett with a firm handshake and Elliot with a pat on the shoulder. "Good to see you both," he says simply and means it. After Dominic leaves, the family gathers around the table. This is the moment Mary has been waiting for, not just to have her sons back in her home, but to have them back in her life. To have them trust her again. To have them see her not as a victim of manipulation, but as the strong, purposeful woman she's always been. As they pass dishes and pour drinks, Elliot clears his throat. His voice carries the weight of lessons learned the hard way. "Mom," he says, and everyone grows quiet. "We promise. Never again. No matter what we think we see." Garrett picks up where his brother leaves off, his own voice thick with emotion. "We listen first. Boys. We give you the benefit of the doubt. We ask questions before we make accusations." Mary reaches across the table and places her hands over both of theirs. Her eyes are glistening, but she's not crying from sadness. These are tears of healing. "Your father would be proud of you," she says softly. "Not because you're perfect, nobody is, but because you came back. Because you admitted you were wrong. Because you chose to rebuild rather than stay broken." Before we continue with how this story ends, do me a favor. If these family stories are teaching you something about communication, trust, and the danger of assumptions, hit that subscribe button. These lessons could save your own family from similar heartbreak. Don't let this be just another video you watch and forget. Now, as the Henderson family sits together, passing food and sharing stories, there's something different in the air. It's not just forgiveness, it's transformation. They're not the same people they were 3 months ago. They've been broken and rebuilt, and like any broken bone that heals properly, they're stronger at the fracture point. Sloane and Trevor, who witnessed the worst of the family breakdown, now see the best of the family restoration. They see what it looks like when people choose humility over pride, when they choose connection over being right. The conversation flows naturally now. Talk of Garrett's upcoming promotion, Elliot's new project at work, plans for Thanksgiving, memories of Vincent that make them laugh instead of cry. And through it all, Vincent's photograph on the wall seems to smile down at them. Not the life insurance check that caused such devastation. Not the paperwork that was so catastrophically misunderstood. Just Vincent himself, captured in a moment of joy, forever watching over the family he loved enough to plan for even after his death. Mary looks around her table and realizes something profound. Her sons thought they were protecting her, but they were actually protecting themselves from the fear of losing control, from the vulnerability of grief, from the uncomfortable truth that life continues and changes even after devastating loss. They thought they saw betrayal. They thought they saw their mother being manipulated. They thought they saw their father's legacy being stolen. But what they really saw, what they finally came to understand, was a mother honoring her husband's final gift in the most meaningful way possible. They saw a woman strong enough to think beyond her own immediate needs and create something lasting. They saw love that transcends death and touches lives that will never know Vincent's name but will forever benefit from his foresight. The meal winds down, and as Mary brings out coffee and dessert, Elliot asks the question that's been on his mind. "Mom, why didn't you just tell us from the beginning? Why let us think you were spending the money on yourself?" Mary considers this carefully. "Because, sweetheart, I shouldn't have had to explain myself. Yes, communication is important. We all learned that lesson. But there's something else we learned too. Trust isn't just about talking. It's about believing the best in people until you have real proof otherwise. You both loved me enough to want to protect me, but you didn't trust me enough to let me make my own decisions. That's what we're rebuilding now, not just communication but fundamental trust. It's a hard truth, but they receive it the way mature people receive hard truths, with reflection rather than defensiveness. As the afternoon stretches toward evening, as the laughter comes more easily and the comfort of family settles over the house like a warm blanket, Mary looks at her sons and sees their father in both of them. She sees Vincent's determination in Garrett, his passion in Elliot. But more than that, she sees their capacity for growth, for change, for becoming better versions of themselves through failure and redemption. 3 months ago, this family stood on the edge of permanent fracture. 3 months ago, assumptions nearly destroyed what 2 decades of love had built. 3 months ago, the Henderson family almost became a cautionary tale of how grief and suspicion can poison everything they touch. But today there's something else entirely. They're proof that families can survive even the worst misunderstandings if they're willing to face the truth, admit their mistakes, and choose repair over resentment. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever made an assumption about someone that turned out to be completely wrong? How did you handle it when you discovered the truth? Share your story in the comments, because your experience might help someone else avoid the same mistake. The sun is setting as the family finally begins to leave. There are long hugs at the door, promises to get together next week, genuine smiles that speak of authentic healing. As Mary closes the door behind the last of them, she stands in her quiet house and feels something she hasn't felt in months: complete peace. She walks to the mantel and picks up the photograph of the scholarship recipient, that young girl whose father's death left her future uncertain until Vincent's love reached across the grave to help her. "We did it, Vincent," Mary whispers to her husband's photograph. "Just like we planned. Just like we talked about in those last days. Your love is still changing lives, still making a difference. And our boys finally understand." In the end, this story isn't really about life insurance or money or even about a scholarship trust, as important as those things are. This story is about what happens when we let fear and assumption override trust and communication. It's about how grief can twist our perceptions and make us see threats where none exist. It's about the courage it takes to admit we were wrong and the strength it takes to forgive. Mary Henderson thought she was simply honoring her husband's wishes and creating something meaningful from tragedy. She never imagined it would nearly cost her relationship with her sons. But she also never imagined that going through this fire would ultimately make their family bonds stronger than ever before. Garrett and Elliot Henderson thought they were protecting their mother from a predatory financial advisor. They never imagined they were actually the ones inflicting harm, that their intervention would nearly kill the woman they were trying to save. But they also never imagined that their mistake would teach them the most important lesson of their adult lives: that love without trust is just control wearing a disguise. And Dominic Keller, the man who became the unwitting villain in a story that had no real villain, handled the entire situation with a grace that speaks to his character. He could have been angry, defensive, or vindictive. Instead, he understood that grief makes people act in ways they normally wouldn't, and he gave this family the space to find their way back to each other. The Vincent Henderson Memorial Scholarship Trust stands now as something far more than a charitable organization. It's a monument to what can happen when we choose understanding over assumption, when we choose to seek truth instead of jumping to conclusions, when we choose to trust the people we love even when we don't fully understand their decisions. Every year, when a new scholarship recipient is announced, when a young person gets the chance to pursue their dreams despite devastating family loss, it won't just be Vincent's legacy living on. It will also be the legacy of a family that was broken by misunderstanding and healed by truth. A family that learned that assumptions can destroy everything, but humility and communication can rebuild anything. As the evening settles over Mary's quiet neighborhood, as the lights come on in houses up and down the street, as families everywhere navigate their own challenges and misunderstandings, the Henderson family's story stands as both warning and hope. Warning: that assumptions, no matter how well-intentioned, can destroy the very things we're trying to protect. And hope: that even the worst family fractures can heal if we're willing to face the truth, admit our mistakes, and choose love over being right. Don't let assumptions destroy what matters most in your life. Don't let fear masquerade as protection. Don't let grief twist your perception until you can't see the people you love clearly anymore. Instead, do what the Henderson family finally learned to do: ask questions. Seek truth. Trust first. Communicate openly. And when you're wrong, because we all are sometimes, have the courage to admit it and the strength to make it right. Because in the end, that's what family really means. Not perfection but persistence. Not always getting it right but always finding your way back to each other. Not avoiding mistakes but learning from them and becoming better because of them. The Henderson family nearly lost everything over a misunderstanding. But they gained something even more valuable in the end. They gained wisdom, they gained humility, and they gained an unshakable foundation of trust that will carry them through whatever comes next. And somewhere Vincent Henderson is smiling, knowing that even in death his love continues to teach his family the lessons that matter most. Don't let assumptions destroy what matters. Always seek the truth. Always choose understanding. Always choose love.